Well, it wasn't too daunting, was it?
I, no, I managed.
Seems like you managed just quite fine.
I had to
I
do
always,
the
uh
learning curve uptick, but it's just been a while.
Did you ever use any kind of thing like this before the pandemic? Zoom?
Yes, I did
I
a
don't,
little.
I don't think I ever did. It was like, okay, now I get to
I
do it this way.
I had friends that actually got married on Zoom during the pandemic.
That's unbelievable.
I know.
Why is the question?
They're not teenagers. So
Well, I have Victoria Adams here today, and the last time we saw each other, I was sitting next to you at SWAIA's big event, Indian Market, where you had just won the best of what do they call that? It was best of division, but it was
it was
diverse arts, right?
diverse. The division was diverse arts.
Yes, exactly. And which you're a silversmith and a jeweler and
Goldsmith.
and a goldsmith. Well, that's actually you're mainly a goldsmith, really. Um, and what was that like to win? Well, obviously you put in something you thought would be competitive, and you were more than competitive. You won the whole damn thing. So what was that like? I'm just curious because it's not what you're known for.
It's a little bit out of my envelope. The piece that I won Best of Division for at this recent in the Santa Fe Indian Market was called Sundance on Muddy Creek. And it has a sister that I built last year. I started way over a year ago. And the first one of the series of two is called Carries the Fire.
Mm.
And they're 5 foot tall interactive sculptures. I guess you could call it a sculpture. You can't wear it. To me, it's a big piece of jewelry. And Patrick said he would, if I sent him pictures, he would insert them.
Oh yeah, very much so.
So it's the main frame as a wrought iron shaped iron tripod. It's built to mimic pine poles, and on it hangs three containers, two 3-inch deep rectangular containers. They're made out of glass. The whole piece is made out of wrought iron, copper, glass, mother of pearl, fossils, and sterling silver.
And did you have some photogravures too, Curtis?
Yeah, they're in this recent one, the Sundance on Muddy Creek. I
Yes.
included in my folio box because the glass containers on the sculpture or the article can be removed from the glass, these boxes, these box folios, removed, opened up, and one has photographs from when I participated in Northern Cheyenne Sundance in 1999. And in that folio is a pair of book plates I traded or purchased or was given from a man named Paul Raska, who was an anthropologist that I'd known I met him originally, I think 1982. And he often had Edward Sheriff Curtis work, tissues, photogravures, etc. And over the years, I've learned quite a bit about Edward Sheriff Curtis. And these two pieces that I put in, one was taken about 1911 in Montana on Northern Cheyenne what became the reservation. I think it was already the reservation at that time. And it was of the Cheyenne Sundance, the main lodge. You can't go into the lodge and photograph, but he took a picture of the outside of the lodge, which is a circular structure draped in canvas. And the other picture was a picture of several Sundance priests from that same Sundance. So that's where I was on that reservation with relatives, my cousins and aunts, when I participated in Sundance. And it was the first time I'd been in Sundance, and I was not raised within traditional Cheyenne culture. I was raised in the Bay Area near Palo Alto. I think the first powwow I ever went to was at Stanford University.
Mm.
So I knew I was Cheyenne. I knew a Southern Cheyenne, and my family's from Oklahoma, my mother's side of the family.
Mm-hmm.
But I had never been there. I'd never gone to Montana. until I was in my really early 30s. And I sought out my family on Northern Cheyenne and in Oklahoma. And that's a whole other story. But so these two pieces, these sculptures that were done this last year and a half, relate to my family. My great-great-grandmother, who's Cheyenne, was Southern Cheyenne, and her name was Wantayat, which means stabbing woman. And she married a part white, part Anglo man named Amos Chapman. He was purportedly part Native, and I'm not really sure about that, but she was Southern Cheyenne from Stonecalf's family. And the original sculpture was to house, it was basically a museum in miniature to house a hammer that was hers, and it had been handed down through my family to each eldest daughter, I think from my great-great-great-grandmother.
Wow.
And it's called a woman's maul, and I'm sure you've seen them. It's maybe a willow stick. They're pretty tough. And then it's covered in rawhide sheathing that goes over a river rock, and it forms a hammer. So it was a woman's tool, to break firewood or break bones, to get marrow or crush berries, whatever they needed it for. And some people see them, some of them, and misname them. The ones with the big stones on them, they misname them as war clubs, but they were way too heavy to swing off a horse.
Right.
I think the clubs, the ones for war, had fairly, elongated, narrow stones on them. The one on hers is the stone's about this big. So good tool to have. Teepee stakes. So I built the piece to the first tripod, Carries the Fire was the title, to carry that fire of the family knowledge, family history. So it was a special housing for that hammer. And then one of the folios contains many family archives from Southern Cheyenne, what became the Southern Cheyenne community, and all our family allotments from the Dawes Act, which was, I believe, 1887, when they broke up Indian land in Oklahoma, which was Indian territory.
Right.
So then the second piece was more about me, and that was the Sundance on Muddy Creek. So there is artifacts and memorabilia and information about Sundance in this new piece, the most recent piece. And that was the one that you saw during Indian Market. I couldn't put it in the booth. It was too big. I was like, where's your sculpture? I'm like,
right. I bet you heard a lot of that.
It was a really interesting experience to go to and why I didn't do it at a younger age. I don't know. I guess I'm a late
already
to spring out of an area of work that is this big, or a contour belt, that was, and then into something 5 feet tall, and it would take me a long time to build. It was really interesting. And I fell in love with copper, and I love wrought iron, and I love glass. So it actually, the design of the piece mimicked, in a way, the first time that I saw these tripods were on the Blackfeet, in the Blackfeet community on the reservation, which is it's a confederacy of 4 tribes. Up north is the Siksika, then further south, the North Piegan or the Pekuni, and the next ones down are the Kainai, or blood people, and the next one down is Southern Piegan or Blackfeet, the ones in Browning. So these tripods that hold these bundles made out of rawhide flat cases, and they're painted traditionally, handled rawhide it's not tanned, what parfleches are like.
Yeah.
And they held personal medicine or medicine from pipe bundles, meaning medicine can mean a headdress or a pipe, or parts of a bundle. But some people had them, and they were not necessarily pipe bundle owners or thunder pipe owners. And it kept these special valuable pieces housed in these containers and up off the ground on tripods, and they'd set them out on the west side of teepees and cared for them like children, and they're still in existence. They're still used. So the idea for my treasures, my personal, if you want to call it medicine, I'll call it medicine in the more traditional Cheyenne way, which is actually medicine you could take in your mouth, or you could use as incense, or it's spiritual. I needed a way to translate to build on these ideas that I couldn't build in small jewelry. So to me, sculptures are a big piece of jewelry because I made them in the same way, in a way, just larger format. You know?
Right. And when you did the first one, what was the time frame between the first one you did and then the one that you ended?
Recently did?
Yes.
So the first one I probably started the inclination to do it, the thought process of building it was probably 2 years ago.
Wow.
And in my studio in California, where I now live most of the time, right now I'm in Santa Fe at a friend's place, and did not want to go back to California. I have too many things to do here.
Yeah.
And then the first one was, I had a big learning curve on how to handle these materials that I used.
Sure.
And I had to seek out help and find people with bending breaks and finger breaks and big metal shears that are, the tables on them are 8 feet long.
Right.
Not that I needed that big a size, but I couldn't use a small one, so
Right.
I needed something big. And had various friends that do all kinds of different work say, oh, yeah, well, I work for this, heating and cooling company. We've got all the brakes you need, all the shears you need, all kinds of copper. Just come over.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you'll be sorry you invited me.
So much for the fine workmanship and gold and everything. Now you're working at air conditioning unit places to get their equipment.
Any studio will do. If somebody has tools, watch out.
And what happened with that first piece? Where is that piece?
Well, it won this last March. I took it to Herd Indian Market, which I've been participating in. I believe my first year was 98 or 99. I've been in Santa Fe Indian Market since 98. And it's the first weekend of March every year, held at the Herd Museum. It's highly vetted, beautifully run show. Love that museum. And it has, a nice purse prize. The prize is quite a large purse, thanks to some various great, people on the board of trustees and around Phoenix that support that museum. And even though I've won a lot of awards at both Santa Fe Indian Market and the Herd Indian Market, I've never won Best of Market. So it would be a really nice feather in my bonnet, as they say. So I went, well, I've only seen jewelry win maybe once.
Yeah.
And I judged a few times at Santa Fe Indian Market. And Daryl Dean and Rebecca Begay won Best of Indian Market quite a few years ago with concho belt. That was,
I remember. Yeah.
And so I'm going, well, I need to make something big anyway. Well, if I'm going to make something big, I'll stick it in I'll put it in for competition because it'll get noticed. It's not like this big. So, and it has, I know you never know what to expect. You don't know what parameters the judges are given when they judge. You don't know who it is.
Right.
I don't know if it's political or not. If it was, I don't pay attention. So, I was, when I'm awarded, when I win a ribbon on something, I'm always thankful. I don't go, well, I should have gotten this, or I should have. You put it, you throw your hat in the ring.
Right.
And
and I think it just depends on who the judges are that are there at that time. I mean, I've done it before, and there's no rhyme or reason, I think, to some extent. It's just who the judges are, how it clicks, and how people see it. But
Yeah.
I will say, I always think the very cream of the crop does come out to those very, best of division type pieces. It's usually, and you've judged, so I mean, you get down to 3 pieces in your class, whatever it is, and it goes, okay, it's these 3 are it, really. You can tell pretty quickly. And then the fight out for best of show, well, that's a
whole other circus.
thing. Exactly. So when you made this piece and you won, is it for sale? Because it has all these.
Which piece? Well, the first piece that was at
the
herd, this last herd.
Yes.
It won an innovation award and a few other ribbons.
Yes.
And it sold. And the woman who purchased it just happens to be on the board of trustees for the museum. But I received a lot of positive input about the piece that I did. And like I said, you do it because it's in your heart to do it.
Right.
And you, whatever it is, a piece of jewelry or a sculpture, whatever it is, you have to be prepared. If you make it from your heart and it's something you love, it's hard to go really past that, because you may live with it. It may never sell.
Right.
Better a sculpture. Okay, if you're going to build it, it might be living in your living room, so you better like it.
Right.
And that's how I approach my jewelry as well. I make what I think is fabulous, and that if I had to keep it, it didn't sell, it didn't find a new owner, appreciative owner, and it's with me, I'm going to wear it. I'm going to be happy about it.
Right.
So but the first one, the Carries of Fire, did sell. And we installed it in its house where it lives in Scottsdale, Arizona. Went to a wonderful, wonderful client. And this new piece, the most recent one, has not sold. So I will take it to herd market in the spring, next spring in 24. And I'll throw my hat in the ring again for entering it, because as long as the piece has not been commissioned and the piece is for sale, it doesn't matter what it is, a rug, a boot, beadwork, it makes no difference, jewelry. It has to be not commissioned and it has to be for sale. So, and even if and within I think now the herd, you have to have made it in the last 2 or 4 years. I forget they have new parameters on that. So.
But you would still sell it now, right? If somebody wanted it.
What's that?
If somebody wanted it, you would sell it now and not put it in the herd.
Correct.
Right. So
yeah.
There are people that listen to this that may call you. That's why I'm asking. We'll put an image of this up on the podcast.
When they see pictures of it, they might just lust after it.
Yes, that's right. And if they did want to get that, they would get it from your website. They could just reach out to you.
It's not on my jewelry website. I could put it on. I need a new web manager because the one that I had moved to Costa Rica, and and my favorite photographer retired, but now I have really good photographs, and there's no reason I can't put it on my website, or people can call me directly.
Yeah. And give them your website just so we have you here.
It's Victoria Adams Jewelry, basically www.victoriaadamsjewelry.com.
Okay, good. And so where is it now? Is it still with you in Santa?
The Sundance on Muddy Creek?
Yes.
Yep, it's in the garage, all bundled up, protected.
So let me just take it back a little bit and find out the history of you and where you were talking about how you grew up. Now you're Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho in descent, right?
Yeah, my bloodline is not Arapaho, but when the federal government pushed us on to we did have a reservation at one time in Oklahoma, and they pushed everybody, every tribe they could round up. Right. Andrew Jackson shipped everybody from the Carolinas, all the 5 civilized tribes, right. Everybody went to Oklahoma. So we have, within the Cheyenne tribe, we have the Northern Cheyenne, the Sittite people, and then we have the Southern, which is Tististas. And inflections in the language are slightly different, but those two groups who spoke Algonquian tongue, 1,000 years ago, 850 years ago, joined forces. There's an old story, it's told within the tribe that they were out on the plains pre-horse days in the northeastern plains, and they had run into each other, these bands. And Cheyenne language is Algonquian-based language, which is actually Eastern. You kind of connect it with Algonquin Indians. So they ran into each other, and they were mad because they were infringing on each other's, hunting grounds. So they started flinging insults at each other. You dog face or whatever.
Right.
We're gonna kick your behinds. And they found out they were speaking the same language. They understood each other.
Right.
So they decided to get together and, have a powwow or whatever. So, but when the feds moved everybody into Oklahoma, because of the Arapaho language and customs were very similar to the Southern Cheyenne, the feds put us together, and we call ourselves CNA, Cheyenne Arapaho Tribe.
I got it.
So, but I have no Arapaho blood in me that I know of. It's all straight Southern Cheyenne.
I got it.
And I was just in Lame Deer, Montana, visiting my aunt Ruthie Shoulder Blade and another one named Florence Running Wolf and a bunch of my cousins. And the northern bands, they had been pushed into Oklahoma as well. And they were, a bunch of them were being, I don't know exactly the year, they were being held in Fort Robinson in Nebraska. And they actually broke out in the wintertime and walked cross country and had barely, I don't know how they survived it. But later on, they went back to their favorite area, which was around the Tongue River in the southeastern corner of Montana. And Fort Keogh was in existence at the time, and Nelson Miles was the commanding officer. And as the Cheyennes came back into that area, they dealt with Miles at that fort. And there was also a Catholic mission in Ashland, what became Ashland, Montana. It's called St. Labray. And the Army had asked for these nuns to come out from St. Louis. They were Ursuline nuns, to be kind of a peacekeeping force to help kind of make a buffer between the Cheyennes and the ranchers in the area. And eventually the nuns had pushed for the Cheyenne to be given a reservation there. The one we had in Oklahoma is all gone because of the Dawes Act. So it's intact. It's a beautiful area. They've had to fight to keep their land out of strip mining for coal. They've really fought long and hard. And the tribal business, my aunt is one of the accountants there, is run very well. They have to stay on the straight and narrow to receive federal grants for housing or solar power upgrade and internet services. So they're not big and fancy, but I'll tell you what, they're on the straight and narrow when it comes to business, unlike some of their neighbors to the west.
Who will go unmentioned, right?
I kind of got off track of your question.
Yeah, well, the question was, where'd you grow up? So,
well, I was born in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. My sister and I have one full sister. And at the time, my father was teaching school in Oakland area, and he and my mother built a house in Lafayette on some land they bought. They actually built an adobe brick house. And my father taught industrial arts at the high school level. And I think he became a teacher because the main reason was if he was a teacher, then he could fly fish all summer because he was an addict, loved. So even though I grew up in this life in the Bay Area, and he eventually, when I was about 12, he went to work for Zenith Radio Research in Menlo Park. And that whole connection went back. He'd actually worked on the Manhattan Project. My dad was born in 1909 in California. And we had a neighbor that we were friends with named Winfield Salisbury, And Winfield was connected with Robert Oppenheimer. And he had, before I was born, my father worked on the Manhattan Project through Winfield. And I believe it was triggering mechanisms. And in the Bay Area in California, there were satellite labs for that project. And then I think the Tennessee Valley Authority was built also for that project. And I believe out there they were working on enriching uranium. This, huge. So we were in Santa Fe. It's basically Oppenheimer history area with Los Alamos.
Right.
And my father was never allowed to talk about it.
Sure.
And later on, was an older man, not long before he died, my sister and I found this big certificate about, the government thanking him for his help on the Manhattan Project. And for those who don't know what Manhattan Project is, it was the design and building of the nuclear bomb.
Yep.
And
1942, they came in.
So we moved from Lafayette, where my parents had built that house, to Palo Alto, not far from Stanford, when I was about 12. So I grew up in the middle of an incredible urban area. It was an hour's train ride to San Francisco. And Palo Alto was, even when I was in grade school, was full of music and arts, and it just became more so.
Yes.
And I had a lot of freedom at the time. We had a house designed by a German man named Eichler. But as soon as school was out, now that, as long as my dad taught industrial arts, as soon as school was out, we would leave the Bay Area, whether we were in Lafayette or Palo Alto, and go camping all summer at Tahoe. I grew up in tents. Part of my life was, high school, junior high, elementary school under fluorescent lights. And the other part was growing up in tents, camping. And once he went to work for Zenith Radio Research, my mother and my sister would still go to Tahoe and camp all summer. And he'd come up and, every couple of weeks and go fly fishing. And so I had a really interesting yin and yang life in the way of, I had a father who was a mechanical engineer, my mother who could make about anything, even though she'd had only a high school education. And we were never about what you could buy. It was always about how many tools you had and what you could build. And that was that big. We just had this ego about, we don't need to buy this. We don't need to buy that. I mean, he was always building tote goats and new campers for the truck, or he'd put an addition on the house, or, if you want that truck, okay, be ready. You're going to have to learn how to change the oil. You got to change the tires. And so my sister and I both became a lot like my father. I call it tool whores. We would do anything for good tools. So I think I have more tools than my husband does. And he's built 2 airplanes.
Is that right? Oh
yeah. God. So it was fun to grow up in a family that just didn't, we were always allowed to get dirty, and we'd camp, and I was thrown on any horse that anybody could, round up, and grew up outdoors. And just, we used to go to Livermore Hills a lot when I was a kid. And so my dad could deer hunt, and we had friends with a little ranch. So one of my babysitters was an old sorrel gelding named Red. And so I didn't have much in the way of academic riding lessons, but I could stay on horses. So
where was he from?
My father?
Yeah.
His family was from East Texas. And he always said we were related to John Quincy Adams, but I've never followed up. I have no idea. I mean, probably every Adams in the United States is, related to John and John Quincy. And
was your mom Southern Cheyenne?
Yeah, it was my mom's side of the family.
Yes.
Yeah.
And did you guys talk about that at all when you were growing up? Was that?
Yeah, with her, I did a lot, because she was interested in history. And even though she was separated from her family in Oklahoma, and my father was very controlling, he didn't want her to go to Oklahoma. She couldn't drive. And he was just very controlling, because he didn't like to miss a meal. And he was that typical, 50s
Yeah.
the wife stayed in the kitchen kind of thing.
Right.
And even though he wasn't mean, he was a bit of a control freak. But on the other hand, being raised a young girl, he always wanted boys. He never got one. So he tried to turn my sister and I into boys. So,
Sounded like you kind of succeeded in one
yeah,
way. Got more
yeah.
tools than your husband.
I didn't want kids. I'll tell you. So he was born in Oroville, California, and in 1909. So what he saw going on in California as he grew up was really interesting. But I think he became a teacher, so that industrial arts teacher, so that he could fly fish all summer.
He obviously liked art if he's doing industrial arts, right? He liked that kind of thing, crafts, right?
Yeah.
And when did you start noticing or being involved with the arts? Do you remember? Was it early on?
Yeah, early on, really. By the time I could pick up a needle and thread, or a stick and a rock, or it was always about building something, making something. And my mother was really good seamstress. And later on, when I was in junior high school, she had an antique shop and would fix anything. She called them trash finds, or I don't know. She had a term for when something was beyond hope.
Right.
A big antique cabinet that was in pieces.
Right.
Scoop it up for $10 and then put it all back together. And
so she had that too, then.
What's that?
She had that ability as well to be
Mm.
able to build and to make things and do things.
Yeah, I mean, my sister wanted a new bedroom set when she was probably in junior high school, and so he built her one.
Mm.
You didn't, and I remember when we still lived in Lafayette when I was a little kid before we moved, in that adobe brick house that they built, my mother had a friend who sold appliances, washers, dryers, refrigerators, and she'd bring me home in the back of the truck these shipping boxes that dryers and refrigerators came in, and she'd give me paint and glue and tape and a bread knife. So I would build houses out of the cardboard boxes when I was a little kid, and I'd have her in for tea, and have the dogs come in, and so as long as I can remember, I was always making something. And my father was not very approving of me. Kids were meant to be seen and not heard. He didn't think I was very bright. I've proved him wrong, but and my sister was really good academic, very good mathematician. Me and numbers, we weren't friends, but not in the way he was. So, I think part of it was, since we didn't buy things, I would make little treasures for my mother, something, whether it was just anything, doll's clothes, and she'd always give me lots of materials to work with: fabric, scissors, needles, threads, glue, wire, anything that I desired, collections of antique buttons. And so, yeah, it just came with the territory of growing up in that family, and everybody's mind worked that way. And it's never let up. And later on, when I was in San Francisco Art Institute when I was 19, out of high school.
So you knew when you left high school you were going to go into the arts?
No, I didn't know anything.
No, but
I was brainless.
But you ended up at the San Francisco Art Institute when you're 19.
My sister had gone there, and I didn't really know what else to do, so I went there.
Okay.
And I was, my last year of high school, I lived with my sister in San Francisco because my father and I were ready to kill each other. So she says, just come live with me. So I said, okay. So I went from Palo Alto to San Francisco and lived with her, and finished high school at Mission Dolores High. And I could catch the city buses to school. And I actually could walk home through the Mission District from school. It was about probably a 2-mile walk. And the little junk stores and antique stores in the Mission District at the time, 1969, were just fabulous. Just loved it. I couldn't afford new clothes, so I used to wear, $5 fur coats to high school.
Living with your sister, right? at this
Yeah.
time, which is in San Francisco, which is just 2 years after the Summer of Love, right? 69. So.
Well, yeah, basically she's 6 years older than I am. So she was not a flake, and the flat that we had when I was in high school, it had a big front living room, was on the second floor. It was on Potrero Hill. We turned the whole living room into like an industrial area. We had leather sewing machines. We had, she made sandals, high-heeled sandals and flat sandals to begin with. And she was working and studying. And then we just made everything, and you could sell anything you made. I made big flowered shirts for rock and roll bands, and
Yeah.
I swear we could make anything, we could sell anything. So it was not hard to make a living. And then later on, well, I dropped out of San Francisco Art Institute, I think in my second or third term there, because San Francisco was so gray. I had very little money, and I didn't have a grant or a scholarship. And I think I was in printmaking and ceramics, and I just couldn't see my way forward. And I had suffered a lot of depression in my life. And one of the things that would take it away would be sunshine and water. So I used to swim on the beach, off the beach on the coast in San Francisco, and the water is so cold there. But it made me alive. And I had so much depression. I left, and a friend told me I could go down to the Caribbean and get a job on a charter boat and cook. I think I was 20 years old, and, I could make brown rice cakes. I couldn't cook much. They hired me anyway, so I spent 2 winter seasons in the Caribbean cooking on charter boats, and sailed all the way from St. Thomas to Grenada and back. It was amazing.
Yeah. What did you take away from that? What life experience did you glean from that 2 years? Because there must have been some things there that still stick with you.
Oh, just the beauty of the ocean, and the islands, and the people, and the sailboats, and at one moment it's so beautiful and so exciting, and the next moment is really dangerous. I almost went off of a boat one night about 10 o'clock at night. I had no lifeline on, no life jacket, no light. I tripped trying to adjust a sail on a small boat I was working on, and if I had not grabbed one of the big stays, one of the big cables that held the mast up, I wouldn't be here. So the Caribbean and sailing in general, doesn't matter where you sail, it's a very active lifestyle, and a lot can go wrong, and you have to be really on your toes. And even the Caribbean, the Spanish brought people from Africa, the blacks from Africa, into the Caribbean to work on their land holdings, post 1492. So a lot of the Caribbean is black, and there are conflicts between black and East Indian, black and white, black and black, and they tend to be a lot of the people there who are not highly educated, natives of those islands, whether they're, doesn't matter what color they are, if they were not raised, they were raised there, they just have a different outlook on life, and they can be a lot of them. The culture is very reactive, so they can lose their tempers really fast, and they do toward each other, and sometimes it escalates. And I mean, look what's happening in Haiti.
Yeah.
It's a tough world.
Yeah.
And so you get some of that there. Not that everybody is that way, but you have that element, and it's goes with the humanity. There's always an element in humanity, doesn't matter what culture, that they're pissed off enough that they're going to be violent, and then you've got all these other sections of it. So, and I saw both. I saw the beauty of the water and the sailing, and I didn't scuba dive at the time, but I snorkeled a lot. And would have to go into places like Martinique that was all French speaking and go into the big open air markets and shop for groceries for the boats that I was working on. And that was the first time I realized that people ate guinea pigs. I went to a market in Martinique and I'm like,
Yeah, poor guinea
they
pigs.
keep pets here. No.
Quite tasty, I guess, but they're so cute.
But I mean, what I took away was my health and the excitement and the beauty of those islands in that time in the early 70s.
Mhm.
And the boats that I worked on, the people who I knew were captains who'd sailed across the Atlantic single-handedly. And I met the sailing world is still amazing. And I lived in English Harbor for a little while, and I was caretaking a big old boat called the Mary H. Lewis. She was 100 feet on deck. She had been built in Beckwith, and she never had a motor on her. She was a gaff rig catcher schooner, all wood, big block and tackles on her. And I was able to stay on her between jobs. And I was looking for work, I was like supplementing my income. And so I had my mother send me via mail, I'm sure it took 2 weeks to get me a recipe for a banana bread recipe called Sun River banana bread. So, which I still cook to this day. So I was in this area in English Harbor, had a lot of really nice yachts, everything from funky little sailing boats to really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And it was where Lord Nelson, Admiral Nelson, had a stronghold there against the French, back in the 1700s. So I started baking banana bread when I had a oven and a stove on the Mary Lewis down in the hold, and the floor was made out of ballast stone. You had to be careful you didn't stub a toe. So I cooked banana bread and I sold it to the charters. So my nickname was Banana Bread Adams. At the time.
So that's what's been taken. Now people will start calling you that. Now
Oh God, I hope not. Delete Patrick. Delete.
Banana bread. So you did that for a couple summers.
Winter season.
Sorry, yeah,
Starter season is winter.
Yeah, and then came back, and what did you do then? Because
when I came back, I was trying to get. So I was about 23, I think, and I came back, and my father had retired and moved up to Northern California, a little area called the Scott Valley, which is near the Oregon border, but inland, central Northern California. And they had purchased a house that had been a rooming house on the Oregon Trail. I think it had been built in the late, I think it was built in 1875, and it was a 2-story brick house. And it was in this cute little town called Etna. So when I'd come back from my second season in the Caribbean, I was trying to get on a freighter as a stewardess. The Swedes, there was a Swedish shipping line that would take about 15 passengers, and they were docked. They had a shipping office in San Francisco. And obviously I was still in love with boats, and I really wanted to go to the Pacific and through the islands in the Pacific. So I thought, well, I'll get a try for a job on one of the Swedish freight boats, because they take passengers, they used to, and they need a stewardess or two. So I applied, and I was probably waited about 2 months, and I'd go down every week and check with a manager who was very nice to me. He was Swedish. And he says, I won't know. I don't have a lot of lead time when I know I'll need somebody. So he says, just keep checking back. There were no cell phones, you get a house phone. So after about 2 months of waiting, I lost heart, and I went up to Northern California to see my parents. And the day that I left, the shipping office called the house where I was staying with a woman friend and her family. They called the house. They had a job for me. She couldn't get in touch with me because I was on the road.
Right.
So the next thing that happened, I ended up dating a man who was about my age, and he taught me how to silver solder. And I was staying in this little town. I thought, oh, well, I'll get a job in the local medical office, and I trained to be an EMT, and I was doing all this because I knew I'd lost my chance for the shipping. Right. So I was trying to find my way. And then this man I'd gone out with says, "Oh, have you ever silver soldered?" I go, "No." So he taught me how to silver solder, and that was it.
Immediately when you started doing that this is something you really enjoyed?
Yes, it was really empowering. And even though my father had all kinds of tools, he had never done small, precious metal work. But to me, anything translates into it. Sometimes I build things that they're not put together like I would learn in jewelry school necessarily, at least not back then, maybe now at Chicago Art Institute or, wherever or maybe even IAIA, they would teach it. But at the time, without internet, with that advantage of internet at that age, in my early 20s, it was hard to find your way. If you don't have a really good counselor that knew about art schools and all of that whole other world, that it was a hard thing to find out about. You'd have to go spend hours and hours in a library. Maybe even then you wouldn't find out. You'd have to be somebody who perhaps lived in Chicago. And that was I don't think the Institute of American Indian Arts was, I'm not sure what year they started, but that was early on. So I just took to making jewelry and made money in the first month and just continued on. And I eventually moved to Reno for a while from Northern California and rented a little house. And I went to the University of Nevada at Reno for a while in the art department, but there was no jewelry making. And and it was interesting. I stayed in Reno for several years, and I met some people, a couple young men that had built a trimaran in Gold Hill near Silver City, not far from Virginia City. And they built it in a mining shed. It was 41 feet long. It was called a Brown Sea Runner, big tri. And they day chartered it on Lake Tahoe. And I eventually met them in my middle 20s, latter 20s, I think I was about 25. And they loved it when I came up because I knew how to sail. And they didn't have many crew people. And they'd take these sunset champagne cruises out, and stick me at the wheel. And it was really fun. So through them,
right?
What's that?
Plus you liked the lake, you knew the lake, you'd spend years
a lot of time there.
Yeah.
So everything kind of comes, full circle in a way. And then I eventually moved to the Bay Area, worked for my sister for a while, who had she had a shoe store, and she had a shoe manufacturing business for a long time. And she eventually closed that down and went back to school and became an engineer, a stationary engineer. And from that, she ended up being the first woman superintendent of operations of the Hetch Hetchy Dam on the west side of the Sierras. And the Hetch Hetchy feeds all the water to the Bay Area. All Silicon Valley would not have developed if they had not had that water source. And the water is particularly good, particularly clean. And when the 1906 fire happened in San Francisco, they didn't have any major water source. It was wells, and they ran out of water fighting the fires, which were really destructive. So, back full circle, lived in California, back in the Bay Area for a while, apprenticed with a man who was a fine jeweler in Mill Valley, California. And I worked with him from, I think, about 74 or 75. I can't remember. I worked with him for about 5 years, and he taught me a lot of jewelry repair, and I started working in finer metals, and taught me how to set diamonds. And while I was there, I took engraving in the Revere Academy of Goldsmithing, or Alan Revere's Academy in San Francisco. Learned a lot at the Golden Balance. Eventually I got bored with California and had started in the early 80s going to see, visiting Buckeye and Tona Blake in Montana. Well, I knew I had relatives on northern Cheyenne in Montana, and I was trying to work my way there. And then I eventually bought, in the mid 80s, I bought a house right next to Buck and Tona, where Teal was raised.
Yeah.
Teal Blake lived right next door to him when he was a little
Victoria.
kid. Auntie Victoria. And then I was going to
How
eventually.
did that happen, by the way? How did you just end up at Buckeye Blake's place?
Tona, actually, when I was spending time when I was going to school in Reno.
Yes.
In 1973, I met Tona on the top of a water tank we used to go swimming in Silver City. So I met Tona, a woman named Maggie Brown, who was a really archaeologist and horseman, a couple men that were really great silversmiths, had a store called Hi-O Silver in Silver City next to the Silver City bar. And I met a woman named Shara Penny, who was a singer and sang with Huey Lewis for a while. Met lots of really interesting people. And all those people, especially the silversmiths, set my life on a new course. And when I was spending time in Silver City, I met another man named Dan Murray, he has a twin brother named Dave. And I think Dave lives in Sheridan, Wyoming. Two of the best craftsmen I'd ever met in my life, engravers, builders. They would do big silver champagne buckets with gold parts on them and all hand engraved, or they would do saddles, all kinds of sets of saddle silver. And Dan and I became friends, and I never had seen engraving like his and his brother's. Well, Dan was particularly a good engraver. His brother was, I think at the time, did more leather work, but then now is a great engraver. And Dan and I were friends for a long, long time. But when I saw his engraved work, I had grown up around Western silver work for saddles because I rode.
Right.
Bits and spurs and not a lot of fancy work, but I saw buckles and rodeo buckles and set buckles. And I was a woman of, a child of the West in a way, even though I came from the Bay Area. And after I met Dan and I saw what he did, then a route opened up for me. I wanted to started engraving. So then later on, when I was in Marin County at the Golden Balance store, and I took engraving at the Revere Academy of Metalsmithing in San Francisco, it kept pushing me that way. And then by the time I moved to Montana, almost all my jewelry was engraved. Very Western, florid, ornamental work. And
how did you sign your artwork at that time? Your jewelry, do you remember?
I think I've had a stamp for a really long time that I had Spark Stamps in New York make for me, and it said Victoria Adams. And there's also a VA, just a VA.
Do any of those pieces ever hit the market?
Once in a while. Once in a while.
And when you get them, what do you think?
People get buried with them. In the early 80s, mid 80s, I made a buckle set for Fred Labor. He's too slim of the Riders in the Sky.
Yeah.
So I made it. I met him in the first or second cowboy poetry gathering in Elko, and I was living in Montana and engraving full time, doing a lot of custom work, buckle sets and saddle pieces, horn caps. And so I met Too Slim and the rest of that gang, the Riders in the Sky, met just amazing people, including Bill Reynolds, who lives in Santa Ynez, California, and is a major publisher. I mean, he's published his own writings. He just did a book a year or two ago on Joe DeYoung. You ever seen that book? It's a great book.
Yeah.
So I made Too Slim a buckle set, and he has worn it every single performance since I made that for him about 1986.
Oh, wow.
Every single performance. And I've seen him about 3 times in the last 10, 12 years, and
Yes.
he's still wearing it.
Oh, that's funny. Uh,
So,
well, he
so
picked a good one to buy because you've kind of gone up the ladder of silversmith, goldsmith. I bet you didn't see that coming, did you? That you would be where you are now,
I
back.
don't even know where I am now. So,
Yeah. Well, you're at the top of your game. I mean, you're well recognized and have been for, probably 15, 20 years.
but now I'm not so recognized. Well, I started going to Montana for various reasons, but Buck and Tona were the first ones to invite me to come visit them during the Charles Russell show, because Buck always had a room and showed his work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was involved around the Charles Russell show for a long, long time. And by the late 80s, living in Augusta and doing lots of commission work, I was getting frustrated with florid Victorian ornament and the narrative that I could put forward about my life. I needed a bigger stage. I needed a different stage. And I was really good friends with this anthropologist named Paul Raska. He was good friends with Joe Rivera. And he was from Buffalo, New York, spoke Blackfeet. And he started taking me about the time I was getting acquainted with my relatives on Northern Cheyenne Reservation, which was about a 6-hour drive from where I lived. I started going up into Canada with Paul, and he was involved. He had friends that had these, they're called thunder pipe bundles or medicine pipe bundles. And they're sacred pipes, and they're kept in a big, literally a bundle of blankets and hides. So they have headdresses with them and pipes, a man's pipe, a woman's pipe, all these different articles in there. And they do these the ceremonies when they open them in the spring after they hear the thunder. These ceremonies last all day long. They'll, might start 10 or 11 o'clock and they don't end till 6 or 7 in the evening. They set up big double teepees, and the teepee that's on the furthest west side is the keepers, the owners of these bundles, and they're only temporary owners, but they could be temporary owner for 20 years. They have somebody come in who's very familiar with opening of these bundles. And they come in and this is, like I said, a day-long ceremony to open these bundles that bless everybody, and they renew the bundles. And there's songs and food and all these different parts of the ceremony. These bundles have been around for hundreds of years. And Paul started taking me up to those friends of his that were fairly traditional people, never lived off the reserves. And my first friends were they were Kainai people or Bloods, and they were named the Little Bears, Ruth and Ed Little Bear. And their daughter is married to a man named Adolf Hungry Wolf. She was. Now he's German, German born, but raised in the US, and has written extensively on the Blackfeet, the whole Confederacy of the Blackfeet Nation. And so I was introduced to them and went to one of their bundle openings. And then for years, until I finally moved from Montana in 99, every spring I'd go to 3 or 4 bundle openings. And they take you back in time. They're so beautiful. You just start crying. They're just beautiful, and they're very private. You have to be invited. And when Paul first started taking me up there, they wanted to know where I was from. And he says, well, she's Southern Cheyenne. And so they gave me a nickname, and it was Kistipimidapiaki, which means spotted horse woman, because they called the Cheyenne people spotted horse people, because the Cheyennes always loved paint horses. So that's what I was known. Hardly anybody called me Victoria. It was always Kistipimidapiaki. So that was life-changing.